there's a deep unease in the country about who we take ourselves to be, who we're becoming. And that unease is taking the form of some very ugly kind of commitments, ugly kinds of expressions, and ugly politics, it seems to me. And Donald Trump is his avatar. And the fact that he's attractive to people shows us that we're up to our neck in the culture wars that we don't want to admit.
Hello and welcome to the Bulwark Podcast. I'm your host, Tim Miller. A little housekeeping, a little cleanup from yesterday. After we taped and mocked Donald Trump for not having any of his family with him in trial, his dumbest son, Eric, did show up to court for dad at last. Isn't that nice? Today, he's got his extended family there. Doug Burgum expected to join. And recent friend of the pod, Mike Johnson, will also be there, pathetically. It was fun while it lasted, Mike. Tonight, we got a hot primary in Maryland. Sarah and Michael Steele broke that down on the Focus Group podcast. Go check it out. Link in the show notes. Tony Blinken's meeting with Zelensky as Kharkiv continues to be shelled. And Michael Cohen is on cross. We'll have Ben Wittes tomorrow to recap. But first, at last, Eddie Glaude, professor of African-American studies at Princeton, a political commentator, public intellectual, MSNBC contributor. His most recent book, We Are the Leaders We've Been Looking For. Welcome to the Bulwark Podcast, Eddie.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be with you, Tim. Thanks for having me, Doc.
I'm pumped. I have to admit, when it comes to these book interviews, I'm a crammer. I'm a procrastinator. And usually, I'm sitting there, I'm multitasking. Somebody wrote some political book and I'm on my little Kindle and I can kind of flick through it. You can read 4 sentences on the page and get the gist. That was not the case with your book. So I did the best I could there's some pages where I'm like, man, I gotta sit with this for a minute. This is not a scanner. So, I made it about halfway through last night, but, it's pretty good. It was on the W.E.B. Du Bois lectures he gave in 2011. Mm-hmm. He pronounced it Du Bois. Is that right? Exactly. Yeah. Why is that? Do you know?
I don't know. It might have been the Berkshires. So, who knows where he was from, instead of Dubois, it's Du Bois.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of heavy stuff there. I want to get to it at the end, but we got to do a little news at the top, if that's all right.
Sure. Absolutely.
The former president is on trial. I said we're going to have a report from the courtroom tomorrow. But just as you've been watching this, making appearances on MSNBC from time to time, what is your top line? It's hard for me to kind of wade through the muck on this stuff and figure out what really matters. I'm curious what your biggest impressions have been of the trial so far.
To be honest with you, I'm in the same place, trying to make sense of the spectacle of it. I see the entertainment value, mm-hmm. at least the purported entertainment value. It would be different, of course, if cameras were in the courtroom.
Yeah.
So it's this kind of dramatic kind of event, historic event, in that sense. And then there's the kind of, sundry details that suggest to any reasonable person that this man should not be the nominee of the Republican Party. Yeah. And it leads me to ask the question over and over again, repeatedly, Tim, how is this possible? Right. So you have the court proceedings, spectacle, entertainment. You have the actual reality that the man may have broken the law. The historical reality that the first president is on trial, and then the kind of political and existential question: what is it about the state of the country that this man still remains a political force?
Yeah.
And I have yet to wrap my mind around it, I think.
It's funny you say that. I started writing something last night. I'm hoping to maybe publish next week or the next couple of weeks, but the interesting thing for me, this is a little myopic, I guess. We have all these grand historic things, a former president on trial for the first time, but to distill it down to your own personal feelings sometimes feels a little self-indulgent. Mm-hmm. But to me, it's like I've come to terms over the past couple of weeks that like he might actually win again. This is not a prediction. This is not political analysis. It's just reflecting on. In 2016, I really didn't believe he was going to win. And in 2020, I was pretty sure we were going to kick his ass. And I've now come around to the fact that, I don't know. I mean, Biden could still win for sure. But just the fact that I think that he could win is very disturbing, right? Like, take the political analysis out of it. Just like this notion that it says something about how we look at our fellow Americans a little bit, right? That you like watch this trial, this sad man pressuring this woman into sexual intercourse and the fraud and the gross stuff he did at the National Enquirer. And it's just like, how can people look at this and not just totally reject it? I don't know. How have you, obviously you have a different like kind of background than me. So maybe you wrestle with that maybe in a different way.
Yeah. Yeah. I just think first of all, it's the nature of our political system, right? That only a few states will decide.
Yeah.
And we know that, that our politics, whether you are for the Electoral College or not, right? It results in all of this. It gums up things, right? Where only a certain sliver of the country will actually decide the election. It also kind of points to, at least for me, the depth of the culture wars.
Mm-hmm.
We're not talking about them, Tim, as much as we should, but we know that it's driving so much of what we're experiencing in our politics today. And, to describe it as culture war is a shorthand that might obscure more than it clarifies. But there's something about, and there's a deep unease in the country about who we take ourselves to be, who we're becoming. And that unease is taking the form of some very ugly kind of commitments, ugly kinds of expressions, and ugly politics, it seems to me. And Donald Trump is his avatar. So the fact that this man who's obviously unethical, this guy whose character is deeply questionable, who doesn't seem to be very smart, even though we're often attributing to him a certain kind of skill set.
Savvy, maybe.
Yeah. I think there's a difference between being savvy and being smart, right? Or being intelligent or being curious, right? I mean, in so many ways, Tim, he comes off as this knuckle-dragging troglodyte.
Yeah.
Right. And the fact that he's attractive to people shows us that we're up to our neck in the culture wars that we don't want to admit, that we don't want to acknowledge. We'll dance around it at times, but we don't want to say what's really motivating the American electorate at this moment.
Well, what part of it do you think that we're not acknowledging appropriately?
I think the country is profoundly unsettled by the questions of race, unsettled by the question of class grievance, unsettled by the fact that for some people, and you can think about this in some ways, Tim, as a divide between rural and urban, blue states and red states, however we want to divide it. But there are some folks who believe they've lost their country to these urban elites, snobs, who have their thumbs on the scale for minorities, right? And so the idea of who we are as Americans, right, is up for grabs. And these folk feel like they're losing ground. And they are, but it's not because somebody has their thumb on the scale for Black folk or LGBTQ people or immigrants, right? They're getting sold a bill of goods in order to exploit their grievances, it seems to me.
Yeah. What do you say to people? I mean, obviously, I think this is an interesting conversation because, obviously there's some category, Hillary, the basket of deplorables. I'm not running for office, so I can say that. I can call them. I can call it what it is. Like, there's a category of deplorables. I just want to put them over there for a second. We spend a lot of time talking about the deplorables on the podcast. There's another category of people that you're talking about that feel like they're losing the country, that aren't really motivated by animus, but by just a feeling that maybe their kids are not going to have the opportunities that they did, right? And maybe it's unfounded, right? But maybe it's this feeling that little Johnny, right, that has a B- average, is not going to be able to get into Princeton, to get into Eddie's class, right? Or maybe little Johnny that has an A, that gets good grades, isn't going to get in because one of those slots is going to be taken by, a kid that, gets in because, they, fit some a different marginalized demographic group, and that, the parent isn't upset at, they don't want to tear that other person down, but they're worried, right? Like, what do you say about the sliver of people that I think have legitimate anxiety about, the ways where they might be left behind?
I think that's such a great question, and it's something that we always have to grapple with, because when we're in these moments of transition as a society, right, we're never really kind of doing the hard work of reimagining the we of who we are, right? And so you're gonna have these moments where exclusions are going to be denied, right? The way in which we organize our lives to say that only certain people have access to certain things, that's no longer the case. We're going to include more people. But we never do the hard work of changing the we. We just simply say, now you're a part of it. And so the people who think that they ought to have a certain benefit, right? My kids should have access to Princeton and Harvard and Amherst and Williams. And now they don't, because Amherst and Williams and Princeton and Harvard are admitting, these Black and brown people, these working class folk. And we've put out all this money from pre-K to now. And now my kid can't even get in.
They got to go to George Washington.
Exactly. Go to George Washington, or God forbid, University of Texas, Austin, or University of Wisconsin, Madison, or something like that. Right. And so what you get is this sense that we haven't changed how we understand ourselves, how we interact with each other. Right. There is still the presumption that who I am as a white person of a certain privilege, I should benefit from that in certain sorts of ways. And because we haven't kind of unraveled the game, Tim, of certain people having access to certain institutions, right? We need to understand that you can get a really great education at Lafayette. You don't have to wind up at Princeton. You can get an extraordinary education at Rutgers. You don't have to wind up at Harvard. And we know that people are running the country who've gone on to all of these institutions across the United States and have found their feet. Why are we buying into this idea that the only way to gain access to elite, the upper echelons, is that you got to go to Ivy League schools? Well, we got to change that game, right? In some ways, right? We got to undermine that set of assumptions. And that's going to require more fundamental engagement with who we take ourselves to be. So the short answer to the question is that we have to attack the assumption that because you are who you are, that you're supposed to somehow, benefit differently, right? That you're guaranteed access to all of this stuff. And that's not the case anymore. And people are pissed about that.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, that's true. That's true. People are pissed. And I kind of get it. I get it, though.
I do, too. I
understand why they're pissed. And it's like a frustrating thing for me, because I want to hug them and be like, it's going to be okay. This is not, Donald Trump is not the solution to this problem. Right. And the kid is going to be fine. Right. As long as they work, there are plenty of people who have gone on to have great lives that didn't, hit every rung on the ladder on the way up. Right. It's kind of good, particularly for a kid of privilege, to not hit every rung on the ladder on the way up. Right. You learn something from that.
Right. And we have to undo the idea. We have to unravel the idea that it's only these folk at Harvard and Yale and Princeton and Brown and Dartmouth who are at the top end of the food chain, right? That, because if we undo the idea that merit can only be evidenced in having access to these institutions, success is only evident in having access to these, that's part of the game that we have to undermine, right? And we need more than just simply Ivy Leaguers on the Supreme Court, damn it.
Yeah.
Right.
This is maybe, I'm interested in your feeling on this, because this is maybe where we might have some policy disagreements. We totally agree on the fact that we need to unravel that. We need to change the perception, but how? I was just listening to Scott Galloway the other day, and he's given a pretty compelling take about why he thinks these institutions are so competitive, why there's so much focus on this now. And he's like, in our current economy, if you are one of the top 5% that get into these schools and that get into business school and go and get the job at McKinsey or Goldman Sachs, like, you have the best life in the history of the world. Maybe not the most fulfilling life, but you have the best vacations, you have the best stuff. And if you're in the 50%, if you're in the middle of the bell curve right now, you're really falling behind in a way that you kind of weren't in past generations, at least as compared to peer sets. So that, I think, is driving a lot of this. But I don't know. I mean, you're with these these kids on campus.
Every single
Maybe
day.
there's a different view on that. I don't know. What do you think? How can we unravel that? Is that true? Do you think?
I think it is true,
Yeah.
and it is a reflection of the classed nature of our society, right? I mean, we used to be our class structure used to look like an hourglass. Now it looks like a golf club, a driver, in some ways, right? And the top 0.1%, right, is getting all of this benefit, while the rest of Americans are busting their asses to keep their noses above water.
Yeah.
And that's not consistent with the American dream as it's articulated, right? And so I think part of what we have to do is to challenge the underlying assumptions that inform Scott Galloway's vision, that description. I think it's wrong. Now, mind you, I'm a beneficiary of it all. By virtue of having a Princeton PhD, the life of my family was fundamentally transformed.
Yeah.
Fundamentally.
Well, I read the book though. Your dad was a mailman though, so
yeah, my dad was a mailman. My mother was a supervisor of a janitorial team, at Ingalls Shipyard, right? So there's my life fundamentally was transformed by virtue of going to Morehouse College and then getting a PhD at Princeton. And I understand, but I don't think it's just, right? I don't think it's just, and it leads to this perception of scarcity that has people at each other's throats unnecessarily, it seems to me.
Yeah. Okay. I don't want to spend all day on campus, but while we're there,
sure not.
I'm interested in your thoughts on the protests, on the discourse around it, kind of what's driving it. Is the media over obsessed with it? I just had to, put my cards on the table. I'm pretty shook by just like the acceptance of some sentiments that have, some that are anti-Semitic, maybe not intentionally, but in practice, right? When you're talking about globalizing the Intifada, when you're talking about, having the leaders of these groups, having part of their agenda being, Palestine should have a state from the river to the sea. There's some, maybe that's intentioned in a different way than it's coming out, but it's coming out in a way that is going to cause a lot of, an eliminationist sensibility about Israel. So that concerns me. So I'm interested in your take on that, on sort of that type of rhetoric, and then just also generally on, these campus protests and what you think is, manifesting there.
The easier question is, of course, the latter. I think it's a reflection of a generation of students who are convinced that the country and the world as it is broken. You could describe them as the catastrophic generation. They've come of age, Tim, in the midst of cascading crises, right?
Can I challenge that though? Is that really
yes.
true? What about somebody that was like in college in 1976? They had lived through assassinations. The president got assassinated. Martin Luther King, president's brother, did. Vietnam War, hyperinflation. Then they go to college in 1979. And they all they're the Gen Xers. They all turned out okay.
Did we? But did we? I mean, the question is, did we? I mean, in a really interesting way. I think part of, of course there's some historical parallels, but I mean, I think it's really important for us to understand these folks as coming of age in the midst of global pandemic, coming of age in the midst of school shootings, in the midst of climate crisis, in the midst of our politics and the way that they're shaped, in the midst of what we might describe as the defunding of public education in the United States, as state schools are transferring the rising cost of education onto the backs of working people, and how that then stratify, segments higher ed and the like, and how it impacts the way in which students understand themselves. And so we see student loan debt surpassing credit card debt. I mean, we can go on and on to talk about these folks, and particularly these young folk today. These are COVID babies.
Yeah,
they didn't graduate. They and we're seeing they didn't have graduations, and we're seeing across the board, Tim, right? Problems of socialization.
Yeah.
Right. And we're seeing problems that rates of suicidality, students who are coming in already medicated. Those numbers are just skyrocketing. So I think we're seeing problems that are different. So I understand the pushback, but I think that this particular generation is unique in relation to the problems that they face, the particular problems that they face. So they are, I think, are drawing the conclusion that the world is broken, and some of them are reaching for old languages of order. So they're reaching for the old languages of autocracy, and you can see them in Europe, young folk in Europe reaching for the old languages of fascism, right? And some of them are reaching for new languages, trying to imagine the country and the world differently. So we see students kind of responding to, I think, their substantive judgment that the country is broken, and that these institutions are complicated in their own way. In terms of the specific protest, I think it's also a reflection of the particular ways in which this generation sees things. I mean, how they view Israel is not the same as how we were educated to view Israel, and how old the baby boomers were educated to view Israel. Israel gets read very different. What is the impact, the long-standing impact of the Likud party's rule of that country? How is it being assessed and evaluated in light of the ideology of the Likud party, of that party, right? And how is Netanyahu represented by a lot of these young folks? So Israel is not seen in the same way. So it's subject to a different level of criticism than what it was when I was growing up, when I was a college student, so long ago. And so I think that critique is really, really, really important to kind of drill down in, if we could.
Yeah. Well, let's do it. Do you worry at all about the thing that I think worries me the most is that the racialized framework of, kind of colonizer and being colonized, right? And I think that there's some legitimate social justice side about this. I think there's a little bit of awakening in the traditional woke term, right, of the ways that colonialism, caused longstanding problems. But then, I see it kind of perverted sometimes, like on social media with left folks that are like, showing pictures of Jewish people and like, this isn't their homeland. This can't be their homeland. Look at how they look. They don't look Semitic. They look white. And boy, I don't know. Some of that stuff gets into a space that makes me very uncomfortable, given the history of the region. So I think that there's some good elements to that framework, but I think that it can be taken too far. I don't know. What do you think about that?
I can understand that I can understand that unease, but I think we need to understand the significance of 1948. We need to understand what the British Empire, what it was doing, what Europe was doing in relation. It wasn't as if the homeland could be established in Europe for a reason, right? Yeah. I mean, obviously there are historical reasons for why the Jewish homeland would be imagined where it is and then implemented in the way it was.
Part of our fault, actually. Also, a lot of folks were coming to America, and then a lot of Jewish folks that were facing persecution in Russia, Eastern Europe, were coming to America and then couldn't anymore.
Exactly. And we have to understand the geopolitical implications of what it meant for the West to have a state like Israel positioned in the Middle East, in that particular region. And so to understand the politics and to understand the moment, right? I mean, we don't really begin to see the discourse of decolonization until, it starts in the 1940s, right? Where we begin to see the decolonization of the third world, decolonization movements across the globe, and Israel emerges within that context. So there's a historical way in which we can understand or account for the emergence of Israel, right? And then to understand the history of describing it as a Jewish state, a Jewish democratic state, right? What does it mean to describe it as a Jewish state and to commit to democracy at the same time? So when I was growing up, the idea of describing Israel as a Jewish state was contested, right? Because the idea of it being Jewish ran smack up against it being democratic.
Right.
It's like describing America as a Christian nation.
Right.
Right, those things collide when you think about it, in light of the notion of it being democratic as well. What do we do with other religious groups or other religious identities and the like? So it's only a fairly recent development that it's accepted to describe it as a Jewish state. in public debate. So I think, Tim, you're right to be uneasy about some of the rhetoric coming out of the protest, but I think to delve deeper into the history of it requires us to not necessarily to put aside the passions, but to be open to the complexity of the arguments being made. And that's sometimes difficult to do when some arguments are by definition seen as anti-Semitic. Critiquing Israel is not by definition anti-Semitic, it seems to me. And I hold that view, that to critique the policies of Israel, the execution of its war, is not necessarily an anti-Semitic gesture at all.
Totally concur on that. Plenty to criticize about in the Israel government. Okay, man, you just leave, like, my show map just gets totally blown up by when Eddie comes on the podcast. You know, I'm like, I have this, I have this and this, and now we're going down. We're in 1948. We're all over the place. We're in James Baldwin. But I have two other present day news items. I want to do a little history in the book. The first is there's a lot of discourse right now around Black voters and the polls and how they are responding to Joe Biden and responding to Trump. The Times poll yesterday had Biden at 63 with Black voters, Trump at 23. Biden won 92 versus 8 in 2020. We can go around and say, well, the poll schmoles and crosstabs and blah, blah, blah. Let's just put that aside. There's one thing that seems true, or you can tell me if you don't think so, that there's at least some subset of Black voters that are very upset at Joe Biden. Maybe it's related to the economy. Maybe it's related to the discussion we were just having. Maybe other issues, and they're looking around. At least they're window shopping. Maybe not landing on Trump, but maybe looking around at RFK or Cornel West or not voting. What do you think is driving that? How big of a problem is it? Or is the media overstating it? Like, what's your sense of the whole?
Well, I think sometimes the media overstates it, especially when we look at the polls and we look at the number of Black respondents in those polls. Sometimes there's a shift of 6 people, and suddenly we see this percentage shift, right? In some ways. So I think we need to be duly skeptical of some of this stuff. Also, it's May, Tim. It's not September.
Yeah.
And when we talk about the electorate generally, we're talking about people aren't locked in really yet. In fact, they're trying to keep all of this stuff at arm's length until it actually gets down to the serious months, as it were. And Black voters are no different in that regard. When trying to live their lives, they might not be tuned in the same way that other folks are tuned in, at least the way we're tuned in. Mm-hmm. Oftentimes, we exceptionalize Black people, Black voters, in a way that we don't treat them as like other voters, right? So I think it's May. It's not September. So let's be clear.
They got lives. People got lives.
Exactly.
They got jobs.
And we say that about voters.
We're coming up on barbecue season. It's like, I got to start worrying about this already.
Exactly.
Normal people aren't worrying about this.
We say that about American voters generally, right?
Yeah.
And I think it applies to African American voters too. But I do think Biden has some issues, though. And I think he has some issues around the assault on voting. We had some issues around the assault on affirmative action, the assault on DEI, the assault on quote unquote critical race theory, or whatever the hell that means these days. The way in which some people don't view him as fighting as much as he should, as vigorously as he should. How that's going to translate in terms of actual political behavior, I'm not sure. I think at the end of the day, just as Black folk made decisions in 2020, they will make some decisions in 2024. He has to be clear that he has to engage in the blocking and tackling, right? That requires, turning out Black voters, because it's not about them turning around and voting for Trump. It's about turnout,
right? Because
if folk think that there's no substantive difference between the two choices, right? That their lives haven't been fundamentally transformed by Biden's policies, they won't turn out. And if we don't turn out at high numbers, then he's in trouble. He's in trouble. So I just think he just needs to get the turnout, get the GOTV machine, get going. Don't treat Black folk as cattle chewing cud, so that you invest only in these high profile Black leaders to go out and say, come out and vote for him. No, get the on the ground blocking and tackling. Get into these communities, get it into Milwaukee, get into Detroit, get into Philadelphia, get into Atlanta, and do the hard work that you need to do in order to get these folks to turn out to the polls.
And this ties into the theme of the book a little bit. You talked a little bit about how Baldwin thought about this, how he voted, and about buying time, the notion of buying time. And what is the message, right? I hear all you're saying. I spend all this time on this podcast, talking to, college educated, relatively conservative white folks, right? Who are like, man, I'm just upset about this. I'm upset about the student loan handout. I don't know if I can do it. I might write in Jack Kemp instead, and I'm over here going, no, please. Like, whatever you don't like about Joe Biden's not that big of a deal compared to the threat of Trump. And I get very upset with them, because I feel I don't know whether it's my people, it's expectations, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And I feel like on a little bit more unstable ground, like doing that same kind of, what the fuck to young kids that are progressive and to like working class black voters, like who inflation and COVID hit a lot harder than these other groups. So like, how do you talk to those groups like that are unhappy, that haven't gotten everything that they wanted, and that I think have real anger with Biden over either policy or results?
Well, the first thing you don't do is condescend.
Yeah.
Right. And, when I hear Hillary Clinton talking about young folk, and when I hear them talking about people who aren't, I often, grumble under my breath or curse under my breath. Right. Because
we can curse on this podcast. So it's okay if you need to get it out.
Yeah. Like, come on, man, give me a break. So the first thing you can't do is condescend. Right. You only have two choices. You have to choose one. Right. Right. That's not true.
That's kind of true, though.
But you have three choices.
America only has two.
No,
people have three choices. People have three. People have seven choices, but America only has two.
Right. You only have two in terms of the party, but in terms of what you do, how you act, not voting is a choice. It's an active decision.
Yeah.
Right. When people decide not to vote, it's not because they're just simply lazy. Right. That's the easy account of people not voting. When in fact, many Americans don't vote because they are making a judgment about the political system. Yeah. They're making a judgment. They're passing a judgment about the political choices.
I hear that judgment. But let's say, look, if I'm at a buffet, I'm at the slop buffet, all right, and they got the chicken or the fish. Mm-hmm. I can choose neither. I can be hungry, but like it's gonna be chicken or fish. Right, like that. That's what it's gonna. That's what it's gonna be. It's gonna be chicken or fish. If you have the fish is rotten. I'm brutalizing this metaphor. No, it's like eventually you're gonna have to eat or you're gonna starve, right? And so like,
unless you have no other option, that you only have those two choices. But one of the choices is, Tim, fuck it, I'm not eating at the slot buffet. I'll go down the street and eat at McDonald's or something.
But there is no other street. I mean, I guess you can move. You can go to Mexico. Where are you going? There's no other street.
That's the point that we're pushing back on, right? Yeah. That when we look at the rate of when we look at the percentage of Americans actually participating in our electoral processes, to make the judgment that these folk are just simply lazy, or they're not responsible, or they don't care about our politics, right? Is in some ways to push the burden onto them, when in fact in my view, it's a reflection of the brokenness of our politics itself, right? Of the choices we often have. Now, I'm not trying to suggest that people don't vote. That's not what, because we got to hold the fascists off, which is very different from my position in 2016, right? I see what's on the horizon, right?
Why is it different than 2016 for you?
Because I didn't think Donald Trump, that the country would elect Donald Trump.
Yeah, right. It goes back to the beginning of our conversation. It was just a naivete.
It was. And for somebody who studies this country and reads race the way in which I do, I should have known better.
Yeah, were you mad at yourself? I was really mad at myself.
I was pissed. Yeah. And I'm still pissed because, 1 million people are dead. Yeah. Right. And some of them could still be alive. Yeah. Right. And so the fact that I'm actually thinking, I actually thought I had the space, Tim, in 2016 to break the back of Clintonism. Mm-hmm. Right. I wanted to finally say, oh, my God, we can finally get rid of or kind of break free from the DLC and its children. Right. And we can imagine a different kind of politics. Thinking about what Bernie Sanders, opened up, what Occupy movement opened up, we could actually imagine the Democratic Party differently, because they've elected a troglodyte. They've nominated someone who's obviously not qualified to be the president of the United States. Mm-hmm. And look at what happened. I should have known better. But today I know better, right? I know the threat that Trump represents. So it is incumbent upon people to do two things at once. And this is what I think Biden's folk have to be very, very clear about. Biden has to speak to his left wing and his base in this way. Hold me accountable. I want young people to give voice to the America that they desire. We may disagree on Gaza, and I want you to hold me to account. But we can do that. We can have that disagreement. But we have some folks who are trying to challenge the very basis for us to disagree.
Right.
We got some folks who are not committed to democracy at all.
I mean,
so
Trump
hold me to
literally
account.
said this week he wants to deport people.
Exactly.
That protest that are here on college visas.
So what I say is Biden is committed to a set of conditions that allow for people to protest and to hold him to account. He's not saying shut up. He's not saying don't protest. He might say, law and order and all this other stuff, and I might disagree with that particular rhetorical move. But the point is, he is committed to the background conditions that allow for the argument to be had, for me to hold him to account. These other people are not. And so he has to figure out how to thread that needle to give space to these young folk and others who are pushing for a politics that could address the contradictions at the heart of the nation, right? And at the same time, understand the fascist threat that looms in the shadows, that threatens the entire republic itself.
Yeah. So you write about, in the book, you write about Cornel West, which
my close friend, my
mentor. I think you might even use the word mentor.
He's the godfather of my son. Yeah, absolutely.
Is that true? I did not know that. Wow. The son that just graduated law school, right? I see that.
Yeah, he just graduated from
Congratulations.
Berkeley.
What do you say? Not what do you say to him? I don't care about like your personal relationship, but like to the people that are compelled by what he has to say. Like, do you worry that your message isn't getting through to them? Do you worry that there's going to be a significant number of people that throw this all away?
I understand, and under different conditions, I would agree with Cornel.
Like if Mitt Romney was the Republican nominee, maybe you'd agree with Cornel.
Probably, and what I mean by that is this, Tim. For the last 50 years, we've been living under a particular political and economic philosophy. You could describe it as Reaganism or neoliberalism or whatever. That's had its.
Don't get me excited now.
I know. That's had its impact, right? Yeah. And the Democratic Party, as it's currently constituted, is its mirror reflection. So as we see the age of Reagan collapsing, its contradictions coming into full view, its contradictions evident in its economic philosophy, in its political philosophy, right? So the idea of bowling alone, the idea that we're now no longer citizens, but self-interested persons in competition and rivalry with each other, such that a robust notion of the public good no longer seems to be attainable, right? And so that the contradictions of that ideology are in full view. And the Democratic Party, as a mirror image of that ideology, right, is cracking too. It was constituted to respond to the age of Reagan. So it is full and fraught and vexed, full of problems, fraught and vexed. And so when Cornel talks about the duopoly, I get it. I understand the critique of Silicon Valley money driving Democratic policy, or Goldman Sachs or Wall Street driving Democratic policy. I get it, but the threat of Trumpism, of MAGA Republicans, right, threatens to undo the very context in which we can make that argument. This is, as Molly Jong Fast says, this is the election about whether we're going to have any more elections.
Yeah. Don't we need Cornel to be the one carrying that message? You win him over. I'll work on my people if you work on your people.
Of course, I'm working on him. I'm working on him every day. I think at some point, again, I understand what he's doing. I think there has to be an off ramp at some point.
Yeah.
But I love him to death. I love him to life, actually, but
Yeah.
I disagree with him on this issue.
If we survive November and Biden wins this election, we can just can we have a rain check? Can we have a date for like a full hour on neoliberalism? And
That would be
the capitalist economy. We just do that, just totally off the news. We're just going to do 1 hour
great.
on neoliberalism, and okay, I want to do that. It's been funny. I just listened to you talk. I was struck. I've just really been struck by something. I talked to Bakari Sellers last week, or I don't know, Times of Flat Circle, but the other week. But his dad protested with Stokely Carmichael, right, and was there in Orangeburg, and he said something to me that just like really struck me about how his dad feels like we've made no progress, or that we've gone backwards. I don't want to misquote him, but it was something. It was a deep disappointment with the progress, I guess. Let's just say that. And then I'm reading your book, and Baldwin's the same. And I love Baldwin. I kind of thought I was a Baldwin completist. And then I'm reading your book, and I'm like, man, there's all this Baldwin I've never even read. And so the dude is prolific, and you're quoting from him at the end of life, I guess, in mid 80s, kind of expressing this same, like a sadness. And I just like it. I don't get it. Explain it to me. Like there just has been this unbelievable progress between Baldwin's birth and then his death, and then another set of unbelievable progress between 85 or whatever it was and now, and yet still this ennui. Like what? Like
So I in my book Democracy in Black, I introduced this concept called the value gap. That behind the achievement gap and the empathy gap is something much more fundamental, and that is this belief, this practice that some people, because of the color of their skin, ought to be valued more than others. And that valuation, Tim, evidences itself in our political, social, and economic arrangements. And it's the through line of American history. So what the value gap looks like in the context of slavery is very different than what it looks like in the context of Jim Crow. It's very different than what it looks like in the context of the first Black president or the first Black vice president, right? But it still obtains. So we still live in a society where certain people are valued more than others. And that valuation determines the distribution of advantage and disadvantage. And so even though there's progress, my life is not my father's. It's not my grandfather's. My dad couldn't go to Princeton, and now I'm a university professor. Right. That's progress. But I still live in a world, right? I still live in a country where police can mistake an apartment, barge in, kill a Black Air Forceman, a Black guy who's in the Air Force, and only go on administrative leave. That we still live in a society where diversity, equity, and inclusion, right, becomes the kind of mantra, right, for a reassertion of white privilege, a reassertion of a certain understanding that certain people ought to be valued. Going back to our beginning of our conversation, certain people ought to be valued more than others. And so Baldwin, under different contexts, that this is the guy who was writing in the 1940s and took his last breath in 1987. He understood who Ronald Reagan was, one of your guys, right?
Well, look,
Reagan was the governor of California.
Sure. Reagan had problems. Reagan fucked the show. I mean, I get sure. Baldwin's living through there's AIDS, and he's living through all this. There's that there are plenty of criticisms of. I guess what I'm saying is though, also just unbelievable progress along with the kind of lack of attainment, right? Like there's sadness. Life is complicated, right? Like there is no utopia. We're never getting to utopia.
No, man.
And so it's disappointing. It just, I don't know. It makes me sad. It fills me with sadness that there wasn't at least this feeling from Baldwin at the end of just like this great accomplishment and satisfaction.
No, because think about it. He's looking at his nieces and nephews. I remember when Trump was reelected, and now that Trump is doing all of this, and I see all of this, and I have to deal with the Christopher Rufos and deal with all of this nonsense, right? And the thing I keep saying to myself is that they're doing this shit again, right? And my baby has to go through this shit, right? I had to deal with it, right? Yeah. Now we just got access to the damn institutions. Now they want to kick us out. We just got access to these elite places. Now that if we're there, the students who got admitted, they don't even want them to be comfortable. They're going to close the DEI offices, right? They don't even want them to have resources to navigate the space. So I keep saying to myself, even though I'm a beneficiary of everything you're describing, right, is that they're doing this shit again, right? And my baby has to go through this, right? My child has to go through this. And if you're responsible to your children, to the generation to come, right? Of course you can say, baby, you don't have to experience what I had to experience. But then you have to look them in the eye, right? And deal with their hurt and their pain and their fears, right? And try to keep the hatred from taking root in their souls, right? Because white folk are losing their damn minds again, right? And that truth, right, is something that we have to tell ourselves. When the fever dream spikes, because the fever dream always spikes here, right? How do we survive it, Tim? How do we make it through the storm?
Yeah, it's a good question. The parallels, I got to tell you, I just had such, you quote the Baldwin, kind of line about history not being history, and I got to tell you, I just read for the first time last year. Shame on me, but just so I was interested to have this conversation. The Souls of Black Folks.
Absolutely.
And it's amazing. I just read it for the first time last summer, and maybe partially shame on me, but also shame on my fucking Jesuit school teachers. Like, what were you doing? What were you doing? Okay. Yeah. Anyway, it just gave me such a much more three-dimensional view of that struggle. Like reading about it in real time, like first person. About just like the nature of like the different strategies, the different, like what Frederick Douglass, what Booker T. Washington, like with somebody who was looking up to them, you know what I mean? Like that had lived through all that, and kind of the anger. Like it's funny. There's like this parallel in what he's talking about and kind of what you and Cornel are talking about right now, right? The same shit, right? It's like, do we need radical over? Should we work with these fucking white bastards? Like, should we, like, how do you do it? So anyway, I don't know. You kind of live in this world. It's a big question. I'm just kind of wondering, going back through these lectures you did in 2011, going back through the source material, like, are there other big lessons? Are there big lessons or big echoes or reverberations that you take away?
The big lesson, and that I took, because I had to return to the lectures, Tim, because I lost my footing again.
Right.
That is to say,
why did you decide to return to them?
Because I'm not okay. I've lost a couple of friends in COVID.
Yeah.
That the politics is, that I'm asked to comment on it every single day.
Yeah.
The shit has taken root in me, and you try to figure out, I'm constantly asked to interpret the fucking drums.
Yeah.
Right. I'm constantly asked to make sense of this when I'm trying to make sense of me. Right.
Yeah.
And so these lectures were really transformational for me, because out of them came 4 books. Right. The second chapter of this book is the source of the Baldwin book. Right. Democracy in Black. I was writing at the same time as I was thinking through these ideas. And so I wanted to go back and see what I was doing. And what happened was, 2011 to 2020, 23, so much had happened. So much had changed. And so I wanted to find resources to kind of find my feet, to think anew. And one of the things that came to me as I rewrote them and revisited them and revised them is that, we got to become better people. It sounds cliche, Doc, but we're never going to, if we're the leaders that we've been looking for, if everyday ordinary people are going to take on the responsibility of that democracy demands, because Madison is right. Democracy doesn't work if we don't have a certain character. If there's not a certain virtue evident in the person, democracy is going to collapse. So we got to be certain kinds of people for democracy to work. Well, why are we so willing to throw democracy away on behalf of certain things or certain people, right? So we got to become better people. In order for us to become better people, we got to build a better world, because the world as it's currently organized gets in the way of you and I being better people. And so I wanted that insight, right? that at the heart of me reaching for higher forms of excellences in pursuit of a more just world, that's a radical politics. Suddenly I have a bridge. It's not personal responsibility talk. That's not quite what I mean.
Explain
but it's
that.
something about working on being more decent, working on reaching for a better way of orienting oneself to one's fellows, right? Of understanding the good as critical to one's self-conception, which would then lead us not to be selfish, not to be greedy, not to be so open to mean-spiritedness and cruelty, right? Yeah. We got to be better people. And so what I was trying to do in the book is to give philosophical weight to that easy formulation. Right? Without saying that it's, because I don't want to say that it's just me being a better person that can make the world better. Yeah. No. We have to do it together. So when you and I disagree on policy issues, Tim, when we come at it from a different way, but we're a coalition of the decent, that you and I are committed to a world where everybody, no matter who they love, no matter the color of their skin, no matter their gender, no matter their class position, that you should be able not only to dream dreams, but to make that dream a reality. And we want to build a world where that's possible. Now we can disagree about how we get there.
Yeah.
But we're a coalition of the decent. But there's some folk out here, Tim. There's some folk out here who don't give a I was about to cuss, who don't give a damn about other people. And they are more willing, and this is I know I'm going on and on about this, but I just wanted to say this. There are folk, and we know this at the heart of policy. Oh, if you're going to let black folks swim in our pools, we won't have fucking swimming pools. If you're going to let black folk into our schools, fuck it, we're going to leave those schools and start sex schools. And we want you to take your tax dollars and fund our sex schools. If you're going to integrate the country, we're going to divest from public life.
Yeah.
And we're going to create a rhetoric to suggest that big government that's trying to reimagine society is oppressing us by forcing us to live with them. That's not decent. It's not loving. It's not virtuous. And we've been willing to throw democracy in the trash bin because of it.
We literally just you're just saying this, just a story just prompted my mind. We just here in Louisiana, I'm in Louisiana, up in Baton Rouge, a group of people literally it's not decolonized, but created a new jurisdiction.
Yes.
Like mostly white people that they're like, we don't want to be part of Baton Rouge anymore. Too many black people in this democracy. And they've created some new jurisdiction. I forget what it's called, but I'm like, that they're doing exactly what you're talking about. All right. It's crazy. I want to close with this.
Sure.
Speaking of indecent people, not our vice president, but the people who were making fun of our vice president for something she said yesterday and attacking her and being harsh. And I watched it. I was like, man, I actually think this is right and good, and we should hear more from her on it. Right. I want to play the clip, but the lead up to the clip, because it's a shorter clip that people are dunking on. The lead up to the clip was she was talking about some advice her mother gave her. She said, "Don't you ever let anybody tell you who you are. You tell them who you are. Don't ever carry as a personal burden your capacity to do whatever you dream and aspire to do based on other people's limited ability to see who can do what." And then she says this:
"We have to know that sometimes people will open the door for you and leave it open. Sometimes they won't. And then you need to kick that fucking door down."
I don't know, I mean, people are giving her trouble for that, but isn't that what we need more of out of her?
Absolutely.
And out of our leaders, out of everybody?
We need people to be real and honest and genuine, right? And, this false, clutching of the pearls, as it were, Tim. Yeah. I mean, give me a freaking break. These are the same people who are ardent supporters of Donald Trump, right? Some of these people are, right? And, these are the folks who want to police, manners, the manners of folk in public space from the vantage point of what? Of what commitment? So she's right. Right. And to say it in that way is to understand what is often required of us to break through those doors. Baldwin has this wonderful line in Many Thousands Gone. He says, and I'm paraphrasing him here, he says, oftentimes we have to wash our faces blank in order to wash away your guilt. That the precondition for my entree into your spaces is that I have to leave the particularity of who I am at the door. That's the only way I can get in. So if I want to bring the fullness of who I am into a room, sometimes that requires breaking the fucking door down, right? To just walk through it with the fullness of who I take myself to be. And you know what? We have yet to figure out how to be together when I bring the fullness of who I am into the room, when you bring the fullness of who you are into the room. And folk just simply figure out how to live together genuinely without the masks. So I'm glad she did it. And it says more about the folks who are complaining than it does about her.
Man, that's beautiful. That's exactly right. Eddie Glaude, thank you so much for doing this. That's so good. Please come back again soon. I got my notes. I got so much we didn't get to. Man, there's just so much out there. Man, that's because
I'm running my mouth too much, man.
No. It was really good. I appreciate you very much. The book, We Are the Leaders We've Been Looking For. He's got a bunch of other books. Go ahead and get those too. Come on back to the Bulwark Podcast sometime soon. I'm gonna work on Chris Christie and Nikki Haley and Liz Cheney and Mitt Romney. You got to work on Cornel. All right,
West.
That's just the deal.
I got you. That's our deal. We're gonna work on it. I promise.
We'll see you soon. We'll see everybody back here tomorrow with Ben Wittes talking about the Stormy Daniels Michael Cohen trial. Maybe a little less uplifting than this podcast. We'll see y'all then. Peace.